Welcome to the first of, I hope, very many conversations about things that are happening in our world. And welcome to Deb, who is our guest for the day. My name is Judy Coder, and I have no particular expertise in current affairs. I am a musician and an author and a composer, and in my spare time, I make jewelry. But I have, like most people, become very interested in current events. And some of the current events warrant a little bit of discussion. And I have invited my friend Deb to join me today so that we can talk more specifically about just two subjects, one or two, about history, heroes, museums, history and heritage, specifically what's going on today with statues and flags in the United States. And so with that, I welcome Deb. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Judy. I'm Deb Goodrich, and I am a journalist from way back, historian, and my area of focus in history is American history, basically from 1850 to about 1880, 90. So that covers the Civil War, it covers Bleeding Kansas, which I think is the most fascinating time in American history, and it covers the Plains Indian Wars. So that's pretty much my historical focus. I have a weekly television show in Kansas and beyond called Around Kansas, which is mostly features, and I throw a lot of history into that because I love it and I think people need to appreciate it. I am the historian in residence at the Fort Wallace Museum in Wallace, Kansas, which is about 20 miles from the Colorado border. So far western Kansas, the High Plains. I've got 2 or 3 other jobs. I'm the publicity person, the chair for the 200th anniversary of the Santa Fe Trail, which is coming up next year in 2021. So my whole life revolves around history and telling history, interpreting history, researching history. You know, I try not to live in the past, but my focus is pretty much there. I'm working on a couple of film projects. I've been in 20 documentaries, maybe, had a hand in making a few. And so that's my life in a big nutshell.
I know that when I have done some performing, I've been surprised at the number of people that are interested in family history because I bring it up. One of the performances that we do quite often as part of the duo Notable Exceptions, we performed Junie Fisher's song, The River, the same river. And in the beginning of that song, I introduced the new instrument that I'm going to pull out, which is the oldest instrument we have in our possession. It is the fife that my great-great-great-grandfather carried onto the battlefield in the Civil War. And I'm amazed at the number of people that stop me either before or after and want to know which side he was on. And we've had that with other songs too. Some songs that are about the Bleeding Kansas history portion of Kansas history, and we don't even sing those songs anymore because they're so explosive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm remarkable. It's remarkable for me because I know, even though I don't know the names of all of the soldiers, that I have family history that covers both sides of the Civil War. And I have the fife from that one person, but I know that the cousin of mine that keeps the family history
Mm-hmm.
has Civil War letters from, was it Order Number 11 in Missouri? There
Mm-hmm.
were people in my family that were living in Missouri at that time, and they enlisted in the local regiment. And I know that we had people on both sides during the Civil War, and I think people that have had family in the United States for a long period of time can probably say that.
Right.
You also have Civil War history in your family, don't you?
Of course, I grew up in southwestern Virginia. I went to high school in Stewart, Virginia, named for J.E.B. Stewart, who was a Confederate cavalry commander. In Patrick County, named for Patrick Henry, the voice of the Revolution. You couldn't turn around, you couldn't throw a rock without bumping into some kind of history. And I was very proud of being a Virginian. I'm still proud of being a Virginian. America's birth story, you know, our origin story is Virginia. It's truly our creation myth is Virginia. Grew up very aware of my history. I grew up very aware that I had Confederate ancestors. My grandfather was born in 1894, my mother's dad, and his dad was a Civil War veteran. His dad, his uncles, everybody in the community had served in the Civil War, of course, on the Confederate side. Now, we were a mountainous community, so we're not far from the West Virginia line, and of course West Virginia seceded from Virginia during the Civil War. And so we were not, in our part of the county at least, which was more mountainous, there were few if any slaves. They were Scots-Irish mostly, who did not believe in slavery. So it was a very unique perspective, I think. We were not the deep South. We were the South, but we were not the deep South, and it's different. I didn't realize how different until, oh, I was in my 20s, I guess, and I was the census taker in Pilot Mountain, North Carolina, Mount Pilot, if you watch Mayberry.
Ah, okay.
Um, and I was struck by the difference because that's in the Piedmont. So you've got bigger farms. You would have had actual plantations back in the day. And in Pilot Mountain, when I was young, the rich white people lived on Main Street, and the black people, many of them uh, who worked for those folks, lived on the street behind them. And I went into houses where black women were doing ironing for the rich people, and they had nice homes. They had nice brick middle class homes, just like the house we lived in. So it wasn't like they were living in poverty by any means, but there was a very distinct social class in place, and that was I a glimpse of what the old South looked like. And that was, yeah, that was kind of an eye opener for me. Um, I enjoy, um, there you are. I enjoy researching the family history, and I enjoy finding the connections. Like when we studied the Great Wagon Road that came down out into Southwest Virginia and the Carolinas, when you know that you have family that traveled that, it makes it much more real. And so I love the family connections. And my connections, my first love of history, Judy, came from going with my granny to take care of the family cemetery. And we would go to the cemetery on the land, donated by my great grandmother, the church that was built, donated on the land by my great grandmother. And we would tend those graves, and Granny would tell me about those people. And I understood it at a very early age that those lives were equal to mine, that were as, they had been as alive as I was. A concept for not only children, but for all people to get that those, we look at the past like it's some big soup, and not these individual lives. And I understood that because of Granny in that cemetery very early on. And that has made all the difference in my perspective about history.
Excellent. And are there any monuments in the South to your family? Are there any Jeb Stuart statues? Because I know.
Oh, yeah, Jeb Stuart's a big deal. And he, of course, on the courthouse lawn in Patrick County, there is a Confederate soldier monument like in every other courthouse town in the South. And there is a plaque, a bronze relief of Jeb Stuart on the monument. And obviously it was not named for him until after the Civil War. I think in the 1870s or 80s, the town was renamed. It was originally Taylorsville, and it was renamed for him after he died in the Civil War. Now, what's real interesting, and of course, Jeb also has a monument on Monument Avenue in Richmond. So that's one of the more controversial monuments that's been in the news. What is very interesting about Jeb, and this is one reason I stayed in Kansas and one reason I studied Kansas history, I followed Jeb out here. He was in the U.S. Army in the Kansas Territory. Most of his adult life was spent in Kansas. He served at Fort Leavenworth, at Fort Riley, and then at Fort Wise in the Kansas Territory, which now is Colorado. That was his last duty station. And one of his last letters home, I think, is so telling. And this is written in January, the first week or two of January of 1861. And Jeb wrote home and he said, "I know you're wondering what I'm going to do, because at this point the country is falling apart." And he says, "I go with Virginia, whether she be alone or otherwise, I go with Virginia." And that's where his allegiance was. His home was Virginia. It was not the South. There was no South. There was no Confederacy. There was this loyalty to your home state, which is so hard for us to fathom now. But the Northerners felt that too. They were loyal to their home states. So, just a couple of weeks after he wrote that letter, of course, Kansas becomes a state. It enters as a free state, just as all these states in the South start seceding. So as Kansas comes in, the other half are taking their balls and going home. Yeah. And we often say, Judy, in our lifetime, people have you heard say, "Oh, wins this election, I'm leaving." And of course they never do, but that's what happened in the Civil War. Lincoln was elected and they left. They said, but that whole union was an iffy thing then. It really was. And this whole notion of your home state, it's like Robert E. Lee said, "I cannot raise my sword against my friends and family. I cannot do that." And it's a very complicated decision. And there's no doubt in my mind that slavery is the primary cause of the war and the expansion of slavery. But slavery is not what motivated many people to fight. It motivated some people, but not everyone. And I dare say not the majority. Mm-hmm. They were motivated by their loyalties to, and people don't agree with me, but I think that's important, because if we look at the complex decisions people have then, we realize our decisions are complex. Um, we face complex situations just like they do, and the answer is not always black and white. I believe the world is gray, and 90% of the time it's gray. It's muddling through that middle somewhere the best you can.
Yeah, one of the best things that I heard, I believe it was in one of those video conversations that I saw not too long ago, difficult conversations with a Black man, that
Uh-huh.
he suggested that when it comes to history and heritage, that we can study it, we can appreciate it, but we don't always necessarily need to celebrate it, but we do need to understand it. And so when we think about the context of those statues that are in so many public places around our country, we talk about our history and our heritage being tied up in a statue. But is that really where we learn a complete history surrounding that person? It seems to me that when I see somebody up on a big statue, whether it's Stonewall Jackson in front of the White House or it's King Wenceslas in the center in Prague, when I see a statue of a person, I assume that that person is a hero, and that that person
Right.
was, frankly, that that person was a full-fledged hero above reproach. And I assume that, and it's kind of one-dimensional for me, but if I see that same thing in a museum, then I get to get the whole story. And I feel that I can ask questions. I'm going to get more perspectives in a museum. But I'm a museum snob, and I was raised a museum snob. And there are people, a lot of people in our country, that don't even darken the door of a museum for a host of reasons.
Right.
Maybe it's a matter of work, maybe it's a matter of upbringing. It's 100 reasons people don't
Right.
go to museums. Maybe
Right.
they've just been so bored at the museums they did go to when they were very, very young, that they haven't revisited that to find out how much fun it can be, of course, for people of, museum people like us. But if we take down those statues, how does that public education continue for the people that did see that statue as a part of the history and as a part of their heritage, you know?
That's a lot of issues, history and heritage, and the word celebrate, for example, with the Santa Fe Trail, we are not using the word celebrate that anniversary, because in all circumstances, that may not be appropriate. I'm sure it's not appropriate in all circumstances. So we're using the word commemorate. And one of the people whose statue is being taken down right now is Kit Carson, the famed scout. And I know descendants of Kit Carson very well, and that's really upsetting. And um, I think that's a hard thing to answer. I'm a big believer in monuments. I love monuments. And when we were arguing, or not arguing, this is an argument, this was the discussion about putting monuments, statues on Kansas Avenue in Topeka. And one of the reasons that the city wanted that was to show the diversity of Topeka and the different people who had um, contributed to the culture and to the founding. And so you have Cyrus Holliday, a Pennsylvanian, a white abolitionist who came to Topeka and eventually founded the Atchison Topeka Santa Fe Railroad. You have Linda Brown, the little girl who just wanted to go to school with her friends, who's at the core of the Brown v. Board decision. You have Charles Curtis, who's the only person of significant Native heritage to serve as vice president. And he is a very controversial figure. And grew up on the Kaw Reservation and was vice president to Herbert Hoover. And you have the man who authored different statues. You just had Dr. Crumbine added a year or two ago. Crumbine was a champion of public health, don't spit on the sidewalks. So those people who are there, in my mind, are heroes. Does it mean that they were infallible? No, not at all. And that standards me. And that standard gives me no hope. Because if we don't look at these statues and realize these were all fallible people who managed, despite their infallibility and their challenges, to do extraordinary things, then there's no need. As an imperfect, as a terribly flawed person, how can I expect to achieve something good and lasting if I can't see that? And that's a big problem with our active, that we see these statues and we think, well, they were better than us. They may have done better things, but it doesn't mean that they were better people. It means that they managed to achieve. Thomas Jefferson, the founders with very flawed, and the goal that they set for us, that they gave us there. It doesn't mean on a silver platter. They made their sacrifices and then they turned the fight over to us. And the next generation, the same thing. And we get closer and closer. And I think it was Alf Landon. I wish I could think of the quote that talks about the progress of civil rights is not a smooth road. It is one step forward and two steps back. But it is this constant struggle. And we are far beyond where we were 250 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 50. The world that I grew up in is not the same world we have today. And some of that is better. It is not all worse. Some of it is better. And I think we need to have people, we need leaders, we need to look up to. I consumed biography as a kid. When I ran out of all the biographies, Rockney, I had no idea who he was, didn't care, but I still loved that biography because it was talking about the challenges. And here was a person who just met challenges and overcame them, whatever they were. So what I think we just need to keep adding to it. What has been wrong with our history is that we did not include people, that we let people out. And now the pendulum has swung the other way to delete these people and, tell the marginalized stories, to tell them we've got to include everybody. Don't delete it, don't edit it, just put more, keep adding more. And when you do that, people are smart enough to figure it out. They do get it. And these stories are complex. We want to draw a line and put everybody on one side or the other, good or bad, black or white, red or white, put everybody together, robber baron and it isn't like that. It's never like that. It's never been like that. It's always this mishmash of people who won't stay and just write these incredible stories of their own lives. And we need to understand the complexities of that and how you can evolve as a person. Nathan Bedford Forrest is a fantastic example, the man who founded the KKK. And I'm not an expert on Forrest, but I do know a few things about him. He was a slave trader. I mean, he's as bad as it gets. There are people who make money passively off slavery, but he's on the front lines. And he becomes a general during the Civil War, and of course for the Confederacy, and a very controversial man. He winds up being invited by the NAACP in Memphis to speak to their convention. And I wish I could remember the exact date. It's again the 1870s or 80s. And I'm like, what would possess the NAACP to invite this man to speak to their convention? And these people who had all been, I'm sure the majority of them had been slaves themselves or had grown up with some connection to slavery. There were a few freed people, but I bet most of these were well acquainted with slavery. They know his story, but he evolves. He evolves, and he's like, welcomes the opportunity to make this speech. And I'm like, that story needs to be told. That people can growing and they can get past these prejudices, and we just got to keep evolving. And I see signs of that, and those are the things that I think we need to focus on. The fact that we can be better, the fact that you're not condemned for who you used to be. If you want to be different in America, that's what we're about. You can be different. You can reinvent yourself. You can become anything you want to be. You can become a nice person. You can become someone who is no longer bigoted or prejudiced or whatever your challenge is, no longer an addict, whatever. You can reinvent yourself in America. And I wish we could find more ways to reinvent ourselves and to be more inclusive and tell us rather than just drawing this line in the sand. That scares me greatly. Sorry, I get on my soapbox and I just.
That's why I called you. And it seems to me that we're not the only country that struggles with this. When we talk about the monuments and the way to handle things, some folks will point to other countries and say, well, when you look at Germany, Germany doesn't have any statues for any of the people that led the Nazi movement in World War II. Right. But they do have interpretive centers and museums that tell a pretty complete story. On the other hand, there are absolutely, I don't know, I'm a girl from Kansas, but it seems to me that they don't have any statues up for any of the people that were involved in that entire period of time. World War I, yes, but not World War II. And as I mentioned, that classic statue that's on Wenceslas Square in Prague, when the Czech Republic became independent in 1993, they started toppling statues, and they pulled down the statues of Stalin and Lenin. All of those guys went down, and for the most part, those statues were replaced with contemporary art. And I don't know if Wenceslas was in that square the entire time, or if it was protected someplace and they re-erected it when they became independent. But they had to pull back to a 10th century leader to come up with something that they could all agree on would represent their homeland and that would fill them with national pride. And I think there are a lot of places that just, you don't see statues from certain periods of time. And I know that there are certain, I could be wrong, but are there any statues of Benedict Arnold up? Probably not. And in the early part,
I mean, I can't say with certainty.
And that's another one of those complicated figures. When we get ready to celebrate the War of Independence, well, Benedict Arnold was a patriot at that time, and he was a complicated person, just as Stonewall Jackson was a complicated person. And he did things that were good for this country, just as he did things that were bad. And maybe he was not, these people were not redeemed at the end of their lives, but they did do good things, and the lessons from their lives are important lessons. And my question is, where would be the appropriate place to learn the full story about these people?
Of course, I love museums, and I'm like you. I love museums. I work for a museum, and it's very important to me the story we tell in our museum. We were an Indian Wars fort, so we tell the story of the Western conquest, and it's not pretty. It's it's a it's a horrific story many times. It's a tragic story. And one of the pieces of art that we just installed 2 years ago was a lifelike um, Cheyenne warrior. And that was very important to us because the Cheyenne people is not represented a lot in the story of the West, or just like people, or whoever it might be. And one of the ones that we're beginning, we have Dr. Theophilus Turner, is a white guy, Civil War veteran, Union. We have him there, and we're going to add the Buffalo Soldiers, Reuben Waller. So you would have those three races represented there. The Buffalo Soldiers is a complicated story because you have black people who were serving Union Army displacing Indians too. Those are all complex stories. And I am thrilled that we can tell those in our museum. I do worry that so many people, like you said, don't make it into museums. And there's something a little bit elitist about expecting people just to visit a museum to learn history. Of course, our teaching history in America is abysmal at this point. It's abysmal. And this is a story I'll share with you, Judy, because I think this is really important. A few years ago, I contacted one of the teachers at the Youth Correctional Facility in Topeka, and I wanted to talk to them about coming in and doing programs. And I said, what do the kids that you get know about history? And he said, nothing. He said, for example, the other day, and we're talking middle to high school, he said, I made the remark that we bombed Hiroshima and ended the war. And this kid said, we who? And the teacher said, we, the United States. And the young man said, don't include me in that we. That is what is happening in America. And that is the scariest thing in America. I, as a historian, know that we have not always done the right thing, that we have a lot of, that we have blood on our hands. That's the simplest way to put it. But I've never taken myself out of the we. I've always been able not to justify it, that in our struggle to get to this goal the founder set for us, we have not always, have often fallen short, but we still get closer. But if we start taking ourselves out of, then that's where America falls apart, what we're seeing. And that is our failure, that we have not given kids a reason to believe in America, that to see all these diverse stories come to make this country an amazing place to live. That why would democracy be better? If this is all you see, you don't understand that that's the best system. And that's where I feel like the fault is with all of us, that we can't lay that at any politician's feet. That is ours. That is ours to own.
I think that I am hoping that in this age of activism, when people are asking questions about what can I do to make our country a better place, is that we will begin to look at our own special skills and put them to work. And maybe it's not just that we're going to go out onto the street and have something to say. That is one thing, but a person could join a museum board and be involved in making sure that the things that are presented at that museum are balanced. School curriculums, get involved in the library programs and the acquisitions. And there are so many things that we can do. Yes, we can march, and yes, we can vote, and yes, we can write our congressman, but it doesn't end there. That's just the beginning of things that people can do to make a difference in their lives. And, we're beginning to see that there have been any number of influences on the content of the school curriculum over the years. And that has been a positive thing. And it has also been a negative thing. But I think that what we learn from that is that we do have the power to shape that curriculum and make that difference and meet people where they are, because not everybody is going to darken the door of a museum. Not
No,
everybody's geeky like us, and they're just not going to do it. And national parks are the same way. I am a total national park geek. I am labeled, I am hopeless.
yeah.
But there are many people who will not go. And so we have
And
to,
I had not had the opportunity to go.
exactly. And so we have to meet people where they are and share our collective stories. There are many stories. And I suppose perhaps one of the takeaways from the statue discussion is the notion that that statue is standing in a courtyard all by itself, as if that is the complete story. And if it can be presented in another way, for example, like you said, downtown Topeka, where there's a series of statues that tell a series of stories, that perhaps that can be the beginning of the conversation.
I think the statues, many of them need to be contextualized. And my learned historian talked about that Colorado context about when this statue was placed in 1909, that this is why it was placed here and who funded it, and some of those stories. And he said, and I agree with him, that those statues have become historic themselves. Many of them have been there for so long that they have become historic. And one of the differences, I know people will jump all over this. I've done a lot of work with the military. I used to do media training at Fort Leavenworth. So I have a lot of friends who have served, have had careers in the military. And the Confederates, the simple answer is they were traitors. The more complicated answer is they were old as Americans. They get military heads because they are considered American soldiers. By law, they are American soldiers. Robert E. Lee was pardoned. So those things complicate the story. And why were they pardoned? And Jimmy, when he pardoned Jefferson Davis, thought that that was a piece of the healing, and he wanted to see it all come back full circle. I think the Civil War was this family about who we would be. And thank God it ended slavery. It's just tragic that it had to begin to start with. It's tragic that it could not be dealt with by the Constitution, that they kicked that can down the road. But that's what happened. And the Civil War, when you had men who die to decide this question, they decided not only that we would not be a slave-holding country, but that we would be a union. And that, I don't think, was a firm decision before. That whole idea of secession, well, it got tried. It was tried and it was found not to be valid. But those men who served are considered Americans too. And so it's not like some situations in other countries where they were not taken back into the fold after whatever war or who, they're not taken back, but these were taken back. And that's maybe a subtle difference, maybe it's a huge difference, I don't know, but I do think it makes it a little unique.
Yeah, and I can understand the need to make sure that that entire portion of your family history would not just be blotted out. And there's a real concern that if if I tell my story, then that means you don't get to tell your story.
Yeah.
And I think having that one statue may be part of the issue for a lot of us because it keeps it visual. And for people like me, I am a visual person. When I see one statue, I assume one story. And that's a mistake because it isn't one story. It's not one person. And so I guess part of the difficulty would be, wow, I that's a really big statue. And if you pull that statue and put it into a museum, does that mean that you're going to build 5 or 6 more of the same size and tell those stories in the same way? What happens to that one piece of art that some people got used to? And can we tell the story without that particular piece of art?
Hmm. I don't know.
Mm.
I struggle with it. You know, on Monument Avenue in Richmond, um, Arthur Ashe is now in that line of statues. If you take away Stonewall Jackson and Jeb Stuart and Lee and Davis, um, um, what does Arthur Ashe mean? And I wish we could just getting to it, you know, to show how Richmond and Richmond is kind of a, you know, because it was the middle of the Confederacy. Um, Richmond, there's a lot of levels of meaning to Richmond. It's a very interesting place. Honestly, I lived in Richmond for a while, and coming from southwestern Virginia, where we're all hillbillies, I didn't feel particularly welcome in Richmond because it it's a very cliquish city. Um, have family and friends there, but it's in general, when I would open my mouth and I didn't sound like they did, I did not feel very well. But there's so many levels of meaning, and you've got this beautiful statue of Washington in the rotunda of the Capitol that Thomas Jefferson designed, and this beautiful equestrian statue of Washington on the lawn, and John Marshall. I mean, all the people who founded this republic. And when Jefferson Day was inaugurated for the second time on February 22nd, 1862, he chose that day in front of Washington to make a statement that we, the South, the Confederacy, was the true inheritor of the Revolution. And during the debates over how the Confederacy would be formed, they talked about a flag. And Davis said, "We have a flag." And he meant the flag of the United States. That's our flag. And of course, his father had fought the revolution. You know, so most of these men who were there were very closely tied to the revolution. Their fathers and grandfathers and families who'd been burned out. You know, the South was very much a civil war during the American Revolution, much more so than the North. And so it's just a very complex story. And I think that's a very valid point. And that gets poo-pooed a lot now, you know, or we blow up. In my mind, who inherited those goals of the revolution? And U.S. Grant said he had never seen people fight so gallantly for such a pathetic cause, you know, meaning slavery. And he admired his foe. And it's just such a complicated story. You know, there were many blacks in the Confederate Army who were body servants. They have no choice. They're ordered by their owners to serve. But within those stories, there's a lot of complexity. Um, I think this was a gentleman from Texas, and he was a cook, and his son was a body servant, and a black man, and he talked about having been wounded in battle, and he said we wanted the North to win, but didn't want the South to be beat. And I thought that was such statement. And he said, we knew that our forever, and he loved those people, but he wanted to be equal to them, you know, and it's so poignant. And I'm like, good Lord, why did we have to fight a war over that? Just so simple to be wrenching. It's just wrenching to me.
I've noticed that flags have also come up. Flags have come up a lot. Just as we look at statues and we have one message, we look at flags and we don't necessarily see the same message. And of course, there are the NASCAR stories, but there's also some state flags that have some version of the battle flag from the Confederacy. The flag of Georgia has been changed 2, 4, 6, 8 times, which is very interesting to me. They didn't have a flag in the state of Georgia until 1879, and they've had 8 flags. And Kansas was a state in 1861, and the flag hasn't changed as far as I know. And Mississippi.
Flag of Virginia hasn't changed either.
Yeah, well, and Mississippi is also talking about changing their flag because they plan to, it sounds like it's a done deal. They're going to remove that portion of the flag that shows the Confederate battle flag, and they are adding, in fact, "In God We Trust," which is an interesting trade-off to me. I suppose the separation of church and state should be left for another day, but it does beg the question, because there are a lot of people who very seriously believe that seeing that flag is important to them, because that means that's their history. I know when I look at the Kansas flag, it talks, because of the Kansas seal, I suppose. The Kansas seal tells Kansas history right there. And that's kind of cool. And not all state flags do that, but a few of them do. And Kansas is one of them. There's a picture of a covered wagon, and there's a picture of a buffalo. And it says, "To the stars through difficulty," because when we became a state, we were thrown into the Civil War within months. And so for me, the flag is very important, but it's interesting that it hasn't changed. And in other states, it's changed quite a few times. And it's a difficult thing for people to have that discussion about the flags changing, because we attach so much meaning to that. And not people all over the world don't do that. I had a musician friend that visited from the Czech Republic, and he came with me to a cowboy gathering. And at the beginning of the cowboy gathering, I don't remember that there was a prayer. We did the Pledge of Allegiance though. And he talked about us Americans praying to the flag, because we said the Pledge of Allegiance and we said "under God." He decided that that meant we were praying to the flag. And we did put our hands over our hearts after all. And they don't do that there. But we do assign a lot of meaning to those flags. And it's a difficult thing to even have that conversation, because for every person that has a positive meaning attached to that flag, there are also plenty of people who have a very negative meaning attached.
Well, the battle flag, it's sad because in the beginning that was probably the purest flag, because it is not an official flag of anything in the South. It was the flag flown by the Army of Northern Virginia. It is a battle flag. It is the flag defending their homes. It had no official meaning. It was the Confederate national flag changed 4 times, I think.
I think it was.
So the actual national flag was very different. And when they refer to the stars and bars, that's not the stars and bars. That is one of the flags. And so, like I said, it was the purest to begin with. Then the flag is appropriated by the KKK. And it's hard to discuss the KKK in anything other than, you know, I can remember seeing things about that on the news when I was a kid and being scared to death of, you know, the KKK. And I never knew anybody that was involved in it or anything else, you know, or until later on I realized that I had met people in Kansas who had ties to the KKK, and that was um, I'll never forget going to the home of one of my friends in Kansas. And like I said, I grew up in Virginia, so I go home of one of my friends in Kansas, and we're going through old pictures and Civil War diaries and this stuff. And there's a women's handbook for the KKK auxiliary. And this lady is 95, and we're like, oh my God, who did this belong to? Oh, it was mine. And I'm like, oh my God. And she said, oh, we didn't have a problem with the black people. It was the Catholics. And I was floored. I mean, that was, I had no idea. I had no idea. So I like, wow, that was, so anyway, the KK appropriates the battle flag. And so then it will forever be associated with violence. And it's sad because a lot of people I know that had Confederate ancestors who were fighting for their home, could have cared less than anything else. They don't see it that way, but I don't think it's appropriate. You know, when they took it off, gosh, was it Columbia, where it was flying on the grounds of the State House? That's not appropriate. And, you know, being a part of the state flag, that's probably not appropriate. I know a bunch of my friends will hate me. I've veterans group, I think, in the nation, and many of the sons of Union veterans. I've spoken to just about all of those over the years. But yeah, if it's going to cause that much pain, it's like a good friend of mine here said the other day after the church shootings in Charleston, South Carolina, and those good brothers and sisters said that they could forgive this person, and then they talked about objecting to the flag, then those good people, flag bothers them, that would be enough for me, because that's not worth it.
Yeah, once it's been appropriated, it's a little bit hard to take it back. We are also aware that the symbol that we call the swastika, that was the symbol of the Nazi Party, either that or in reverse, but that type of symbol had been used in Native art for generations, and it is still a part of the art in a historic theater in Albuquerque.
Yeah.
Many times.
Yeah.
It's absolutely beautiful, but it is a bit,
yeah,
it takes you by surprise when you look at all this native art and it's going across going around the stage and there's swastikas in it. Well, that's not what they were. it was a geometric
Right.
symbol, but once it's been
Yeah.
appropriated, it's dicey. And
It is very hard. Like, in some of the pottery, you'll see that, and people are taken aback sometimes.
mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
and really
my daughter is Jewish, so
mm,
yeah, that's one that my daughter and granddaughter are Jewish, so um, yeah. And then I have my two grandchildren who are mixed race, so so many of these things are not all of us.
yeah. I think that for us to for us to assume that everything is just cut and dried and there is only one answer and there's only one story does everyone a disservice. And our
Yeah,
challenge is to figure out how to present our story in a more thorough way. And I don't know. I think that each community has to decide what is appropriate in
yeah.
their case. And when it comes to symbolism on a national scale, such as the statue in front of the White House, that there have to be.
Which is Andrew Jackson. That's Andrew Jackson, not Stonewall
Oh,
Jackson.
that's Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
Yeah, and the
bless his
challenge
heart.
is going to be, when it's on a national level, it has
Yeah.
to tell a lot of stories, and that may be a very
Mhm.
difficult thing.
It is. I mean, Andrew Jackson. Um, I have often, or I guess I've done it maybe 3 times now, participated in the C-SPAN ranking the presidents, the poll that they do where they ask historians to rank presidents. And Jackson is very interesting. Andrew Jackson is very interesting because there are a lot of powers of the president that basically Andrew Jackson set the precedent. He went way beyond his reach, like Jefferson did, and um, so many others in some ways. But Jackson, Andrew Jackson is a very complicated individual, and of course, he's a war hero who was elected president, and very individualistic, and he he sets a lot of precedent in office, and he strengthens the role of the president in some ways. But then with removal, um, that's I guess his biggest legacy. That's a hard to get around, um, and if he were here today, he would defend it. He would
What?
apologize for it at all. And so holding him accountable for that is appropriate. That's
Mhm.
appropriate. He was a man of his, obviously, the American people went along with it, or he wouldn't have been able to do that. So it's all at his feet. It's at the generations that lived with him. But yeah, that's a dark spot on American history that we're still dealing with.
Yeah, and we do have a hard time telling some of those stories,
Yeah,
just because there's no easy answer there, and we hesitate to not tell the story. We
right.
need to tell the story, and the question is, what is the best way to tell the story, particularly for non-museum goers? Um, and it's
Well, like you said, I think we have to take it to the people. And I think as much outreach as historians and museums and schools can do, visiting the sites, our historic sites are fully underfunded as a rule. And I think, money for school trips, once again, that's one of the things that was cut out of so many school budgets. And that's so fortunate because they're just things you learn by going to the place that you can't feel anywhere else. You can't get that from your book. And we know kids learn in so many different ways. And I think that personal connection means more now than ever. And taking to sites and being able to take them to a variety of sites, so that in Philadelphia, I love Philadelphia, and talk about monuments. You got these wonderful monuments in Philadelphia, but you go to uh, you study the abolitionists, and you study the founders, and go to all these different neighborhoods. Like, so many of my friends are involved with the cemeteries and cleaning up some of the graves of many black actors from the 1860s earlier, who were so involved in abolishing slavery and kind of been forgotten. My friends, Andy Waskey, who was a professor at Temple and founded the Meade Society to worship General George Gordon Meade, who won the Battle of Gettysburg. Um, he reinstated the Caddo Medal. And Caddo, I can't begin to tell you the whole story, but a black man in Philadelphia um, basically martyred to the cause. And it's an incredible story. And at one time, they gave kind of like a Medal of Honor, in his name. And he's reinstated that. And it's wonderful to remember that man, all the men. That's what hurt me so much about John Greenleaf Whittier, who was so active in the abolition movement, and who put his money where his mouth was. He didn't just write and speak. He was supporting causes and supporting people, and so active. And we can't forget. This is one thing I want to say. I was speaking at Fort Leonard Wood a few years ago to some new recruits. So we have, I don't know, 30, 40 young people, 18 to 25, something like that. We have a lot more minorities, women, just incredible backgrounds than I dealt with the officers at Leavenworth. It's maybe not quite as well educated because they're so young. So their instructor wanted me to speak to them about why we study history. He's their instructor. What do they care what he thinks? So I asked them, I started by asking them where they were from. So this one geeky young man, he'd already gotten the Army issued glasses, sitting up front. He said he was from Nevada. I said, Nevada? Nevada doesn't have any history. And he said, yes, ma'am, we do. And I said, like what? I said, I've been to Nevada. They got a historical marker. 6 miles from here, there was a schoolhouse for 2 months, in 1890. I mean, it's pitiful. He said, well, and he starts explaining. He said, get up, tell everybody. So he starts talking about the silver strikes during the Civil War, which funded Lincoln's campaign and got Lincoln reelected. He was awesome. I said, well, that's nice. You guys found silver and Lincoln got reelected, the North won the war. What difference does it make? 150 years ago, who cares? And the young black man in the back said, I care. And I said, well, so his family had been in Alabama. And then after the war, they moved north, I think, to Detroit. And he starts telling his whole family history. And I said, so what people did 150 years ago, people you never were not related to you, made a difference in the choices you have today in your life. That's why we study history. It puts our lives in context, just like your life and the things you do, especially as an American, will affect the lives of people around the world that you will never know and generations to come.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that little bit, particularly the fact that we can share our stories with one another. And maybe that's the beginning, that we have an opportunity to share our stories with other people and put those stories together. And maybe that's the difference going forward, that the fact that so many people want their portion of the story to be told and for the story to be more complete, that maybe that going forward is one of the things that is better and different about this great American experiment, is the fact that we all get to tell the story and we all have
Yeah,
it, and that's good. And that's
it
not something that
is.
anybody else is doing, you know?
And it's not easy. And that's the thing, is listening to one another. It's like, Judy, you and I both know, like, change, getting people to change, it starts here, it starts with us. And we can preach change all we want, but we want change. No, we have to change our hearts and our minds, and we have to listen. And that's the hardest thing on earth. That is the hardest thing. That's why change is so hard, because it has to start right here. And that is so hard. But that's what we have to do. We start listening to each other.
And I can't think of a better way for us to finish that off. Just the opportunity to hear one another and listen to each other's stories and learn from one another. And I want to thank you so much, Deb, for joining me in this conversation. We have no particular audience, we have no particular goal. It just seemed like a really good conversation to have with you.
Well, thank you so much for thinking of me. I appreciate it. And yeah, we'll just start talking and listening to each other and see who wants to join in. That'll be awesome.
I love it. Thank you so much for your time, Deb, and I hope that we'll do
Okay.
it again soon.
Me too. You take care.
Love you.
Love you too. Bye.
Bye.